Thank you very much, Michael, for far too kind an introduction. It's a real joy to be here, but I'm also here with some trepidation because I must confess to the audience that I know virtually nothing about quantum mechanics. I'm not a physicist. I'm really here to talk about Buddhist philosophy and some of the ways in which I think that it makes contact with quantum mechanics. So in the virtual mode in which we find ourselves, I'm going to do what we all know how to do now, and that is to share my screen, because I'm going to use a presentation, not so much to convey information, but to keep on track and to give those who are watching and listening some sense of where we are in the big program at each moment. So I'm going to do that now, and you'll just have to bear with me for a moment while we get started. And now we are doing that. Okay, so for those of you who are curious, the background here are the ruins of Nalanda University in India, which for hundreds of years was the largest and most distinguished university in the world, and the one where most of the philosophers who are responsible for establishing the Mahāyāna tradition in India taught and worked. So that's kind of why we're coming virtually from there. Okay, so here's our program for today. We're going to start with a little introduction. That's what I'm doing right now. And we're then going to talk about emptiness in Madhyamaka, the middle way school of Buddhist philosophy, and how the notion of emptiness is understood. Then we're going to move from the Madhyamaka school to the Yogācāra school, a kind of more idealistic and phenomenological school of Buddhist philosophy that arose a bit later, and look at the ways in which emptiness is understood there. Then we'll move from India and kind of Tibetan readings of India into China for a little while and talk about Huayan Buddhism, which offers an interesting synthesis of Madhyamaka and Yogācāra ideas, and is one of the schools that gave rise very quickly to the Chan and the Zen tradition that will set us up for some of the later discussions this morning. Then finally, we'll talk a little bit about quantum mechanics. I'll talk about how a Buddhist philosopher sees the differences between Copenhagen and quantum and Bayesian quantum theory and RQM, or relational quantum mechanics, which most of us find a little more attractive. Then I'll talk about how to understand the relationship between RQM and emptiness, and then we'll be done. So I'm going to try to do all of that in about 45 minutes. And I'm going to try to do that without speed talking. So we'll see what happens. The first question we might want to ask is, why are we talking about Buddhism in the context of relational quantum mechanics? And we could talk about that both sociologically and philosophically. Sociologically, the answer is really easy. That's because Carlo Rovelli has actually claimed in public and in writing that it was Nāgārjuna's Madhyamaka that inspired relational quantum mechanics. And he's been very upfront about connections that he sees between the Madhyamaka tradition and relational quantum mechanics. I think he's right about that. So now we'll get philosophical. And I think that some of those connections are even more evident if we start looking at the relations between Yogācāra and relational quantum mechanics as well as Madhyamaka. And so we start seeing more and more relations between Buddhist philosophy and RQM. One of the reasons for that is because in each of these cases, we have a kind of emphasis on the fact that the only kind of reality that anything has is a relational reality. Things are real because they're connected to or related to other things. They don't become real first and then acquire connections. And I think that's the really deep insight that RQM and every Buddhist school shares, but that becomes most explicit when we look at the Mahāyāna schools of Madhyamaka and Yogācāra, to which we'll be devoting attention today. So now we're going to talk a little bit about Buddhism. It's always hard to know how much people understand and know about the Buddhist world, but what I want to just say by way of introducing this is that the Buddha himself, Siddhartha Gautama, and the term Buddha just means the guy who woke up, the awakened one. That's not a name, right? That's an epithet. So the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, lived about 2,600 years ago. And he taught for about 45 years in India and taught a doctrine that was grounded in the idea, we say in Sanskrit, of praticca samutpada, of dependent origination, that nothing exists intrinsically, that everything only arises in dependence on countless causes and conditions, and that everything has its identity in terms of countless causes and conditions. And he argued that the suffering that pervades our world comes largely from a very deep confusion of things that are in fact dependently originated, that are completely causally, mereologically, conceptually intertwined with one another, confusing those with things that in fact exist independently, and taking the naive appearance of the world as a world that we just encounter of independently existing phenomena to be real, rather than to be an illusion created by our minds and our conventions. About 500 years after his death, there was a revolution in Buddhism. And that revolution we often call the Mahāyāna, or Greater Vehicle Revolution. And that developed originally in the school called Madhyamaka, or the Middle Way School, grounded in the perfection of wisdom sutras and in the philosophy of Nāgārjuna, and in particular, his fundamental verses on the middle way that Michael waved in front of us earlier. And in that revolution, we really had a fronting of a doctrine that was, I would say, soft-pedaled in early Buddhism, thought of as a purely hermeneutical doctrine. And that's the doctrine of the two truths, a conventional truth and an ultimate truth. And Nāgārjuna's revolutionary idea was that these two truths are, on the one hand, distinct in one respect, but on the other hand, identical in another. And that the only way that we can understand the world is to understand both the distinction between existing intrinsically and existing merely conventionally, and then the fact that nothing at all exists intrinsically, that everything is empty of intrinsic existence, and that's the ultimate truth. But to say that things are empty of that intrinsic existence is to say that they arise interdependently, and that gives us the conventional truth of things. A few hundred years after that, we had a second small revolution in Buddhism, also within the Mahāyāna tradition, and that was the advent of the Yogācāra, or Chittamatra tradition, that is often thought of as idealistic, but now most people really prefer to see it as a phenomenological tradition, a tradition that really continues the investigation of emptiness, but does so not by identifying the nature of objects and analyzing the objects of our experience, but rather by paying attention to subjectivity and trying to understand how our subjectivity and our psychological states and processes give rise to the illusion of a world of intrinsically existing independent objects, when in fact we never encounter such things at all in our lives. So that's the little bit about Buddhism in the introduction. And what I want to talk about now is Madhyamaka and the perfection of wisdom sutras and the work of Nāgārjuna. So let's begin. As I said a few moments ago, the foundation of the Madhyamaka tradition, or middle way tradition, is the set of sutras that arose at about the 1st century, called the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And there's a whole family of these texts. The first one to arise is the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra in 8,000 lines, the Ashtahasrika Prajnaparamita Sutra. And then there are various increased size versions, small size versions. The one with which most people are most familiar is the Heart of Wisdom Sutra, which is a sutra that a lot of Mahāyāna Buddhists memorize in the way that Christians memorize the Lord's Prayer, or Jews memorize the Shema, or things like that. But the philosopher who was most influential in grounding the Madhyamaka was Nāgārjuna, and he lived in about the 2nd century of the Common Era in South India. And he composed a number of texts, but his principal text was the fundamental verses on the middle way, in which he really argues strenuously for the emptiness of every kind of phenomenon we can think of, but also argues that that emptiness is not non-existence, but is in fact interdependence, is in fact praticca samutpada, or dependent co-origination. And that to say that things are empty of intrinsic identity is not to say that they don't exist, but rather to say that the way that everything exists is interdependent. Most radically, Nāgārjuna argued that emptiness itself, which you might think is the independent reality, the ultimate reality behind things, is itself only dependently arisen and only conventionally real, because emptiness is only the emptiness of dependently originated phenomena. So we find this notion of the two truths coming to front and center in the Madhyamaka tradition. And all of this will become relevant as we start thinking about quantum mechanics in a little while. The conventional truth and the ultimate truth. The conventional truth is the ordinary truth of the everyday world. That is, dogs, cats, tables and chairs, people, subjects, objects, colors, smells, and so forth are all part of conventional reality. Our ethical life is part of conventional reality, what we take to be right and wrong. Our mechanisms for gaining knowledge, our perceptual apparatus, our concepts are all conventional. And they're conventional in several senses. One is that they only arise in virtue of our mutual agreement, common practices, and everyday experience. Another is that it's the everyday truth, the truth that we absolutely take for granted. And another is its truth upon which we agree. So it's nominal, it's truth by agreement, and it's perfectly everyday. All of those are senses that the English word conventional has. And they're also words that the Sanskrit word that is usually translated this way, samvarti, also has. But the Sanskrit term samvarti for conventional, also has a different meaning, which is an important one to bear in mind, because it can also mean concealing or covering up. So if I throw a blanket over something and hide it, then I can say that it's samvarti, just as I can say that, it's an everyday, ordinary truth that in the United States we drive on the right, or that in Great Britain people drive on the left. It's the same word that I would use for both of these. And one of the insights in Madhyamaka philosophy is that things are concealing because they appear to us to exist ultimately, independently, on their own, whereas in fact they exist conventionally, concealing their emptiness, concealing their merely conventional reality, and appearing to us ultimately. Again, we'll see parallels to this when we talk about quantum theory. The ultimate truth about all things from the Madhyamaka perspective, however, is just this. They are empty of any intrinsic identity. Nothing exists independently. Nothing exists substantially. Nothing exists with its own intrinsic nature. Things only exist in relation to one another. So emptiness, in this sense, which is the ultimate truth, is always understood as emptiness of intrinsic identity. And that's important because some people confuse the notion of emptiness with the notion of non-existence. This would be to fall into what we call in the Madhyamaka tradition, the extreme of nihilism. So if you thought that that of which things are empty is reality, then you are getting it exactly wrong. Another way to put that is that when we say that things are empty, we're not denying their reality. Instead, we're talking about the only kind of reality something can have, a reality that is not intrinsic, but is a reality that arises from dependent origination. Now, let's talk for a minute about dependent origination and what that is, because from the standpoint of the Madhyamaka tradition, that's the only way in which anything exists. It's got several different aspects. The first is causal dependence. So when we say that something is causally dependent, we mean that everything that exists only in virtue of being caused to exist by something else, and exists only to the extent that it causes something else. So if I had an apple in front of me, I might say that that apple was caused to exist by the seed of a tree, by sun, water, soil, favorable climate conditions, and all of those things. And that apple causes me to have the experience of a round red thing. When I bite into it, causes me to have the experience of a sweet, juicy thing, nourishes me, and so forth, and nourishes its own seeds, which will be the cause of future trees and future apples. Nothing that we encounter in the world, nothing either on the side of the object or in the side of our own subjectivity, exists without any cause, and nothing that exists fails to have causal influence on other things. Secondly, there's mereological interdependence. So everything that exists in dependence upon its parts. I exist in dependence upon my parts. So if I didn't have a brain, skin, a liver, spleen, a stomach, intestines, and so forth, I wouldn't exist. I depend upon those parts for my reality. But this kind of mereological interdependence goes in both directions, because my heart can only function as a heart if it's in my body. My stomach only functions as a stomach if it's in my body, and so forth. So not only do wholes depend upon their parts, but parts depend upon their wholes. And that mutual, ungrounded interdependence of parts and wholes is the second dimension of dependent origination. The third dimension of dependent origination is conceptual interdependence. So if we take that example of the apple that I said that was in front of me, if I'm holding up a single apple, there's a question I could ask: how many things are in my hand? Well, you might say one thing, one apple. Somebody else might say, no, 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 many things. There's a stem, there's a skin, there's apple flesh, there's apple seeds, and each of those seeds has parts, and that flesh has parts, and so forth. So the question, is there one thing or many, isn't a question that has a determinate answer. It depends upon how we decide to carve up the world into objects. I'm sitting here talking to you. How many things are here? Is there one thing, that's J, or are there billions of cells talking to you? Depends on what you take to be the unit of analysis. So what shows up as an object or shows up real in our world depends in part upon the concepts that we bring to it. Those of you who have been studying quantum mechanics will recognize that each of these three dimensions of dependent origination is important in the development of quantum mechanics, and each of them is important in particular in relational quantum mechanics. We can also talk now about difference and identity between the two truths. The Tibetan philosopher Tsongkhapa, who lived in the 15th century, put this very, very beautifully. He says the two truths are both identical and different. And here he's actually reflecting on verses from Nāgārjuna's Madhyamaka Karaka in the 24th chapter. So in that chapter, Nāgārjuna says first that if you want to understand Buddha Dharma, the Buddha's teaching, you have to begin by understanding the difference between the two truths. And if you don't understand the difference between the two truths and the relation between them, you can't understand anything at all. You have to understand that the conventional truth is merely conventional, is illusory in the sense that it exists in one way and appears in another, is constantly changing and interdependent, whereas the ultimate truth of emptiness is something that is non-deceptive and non-conceptualizable. Says you have to understand that difference. But then he immediately says, after that, you also have to understand that they're identical. That whatever is interdependent, whatever is dependently originated, is explained to be emptiness. They're the same thing. And when we talk about something being empty, that's a merely conceptual designation. That's merely the way that we think about it, which also means that emptiness is empty. And to understand that, he says, is the middle way, is the Madhyamaka. So Tsongkhapa glosses this by saying they're intentionally different. That is, they're conceptually different. To say that things are dependently originated is to stress their conventional aspect. To say that they are empty is to stress their ultimate aspect. But they are extensionally identical. That we don't peel back a screen of illusory conventional things and find an independent emptiness. Instead, whenever we see any conventional phenomenon, we are seeing emptiness, because what we are seeing is dependent origination. We're seeing things that exist only in dependence on causes and conditions, only on their parts, only have their identity conceptually, and that is, we are seeing things that are empty of any intrinsic existence. So the two truths in this sense collapse into a single world, but trying to see that identity is trickier than it might sound. Again, when we think about quantum theory, we're going to see an analogy here between intentional difference between the world described at the quantum level and the world described in terms of stable whole objects, and an extensional identity, that we don't have two worlds, a quantum world and a real world. We have a real world that is a manifestation of an underlying quantum world. So you can begin to see the analogies that draw people to middle way philosophy who are interested in quantum mechanics. Now, as I said, a few hundred years after the Madhyamaka arises, so the Madhyamaka arises in about the 1st century, and in about the 3rd and 4th centuries, Yogācāra philosophy arises. We get this second school of Mahāyāna philosophy. It's grounded in a very different sutra source. the Samdhi Vimochana Sutra, which means the sutra unraveling or explaining the Buddha's intention. And its major philosophical figures are a pair of brothers who lived in the 4th century, Asanga and Vasubandhu. So it's their work that plays the analogous role to that of Nāgārjuna in the ground of the Yogācāra tradition. People often read the Yogācāra tradition as an idealist tradition, and that's because there are indeed influential idealists within Yogācāra. But other people read the Yogācāra tradition as essentially a phenomenological tradition, because a lot of the texts that we read in Yogācāra don't say anything about the non-existence of the external world, but instead simply focus on the understanding of human psychology, human consciousness, and human experience, and how that gives rise to the world that's apparent. And if people ask, is Yogācāra idealist or phenomenological? The right answer to that question is yes. There are idealistic Yogācārans, there are phenomenological Yogācārans. It's a big tent. So I would urge you, if somebody begins opening up this debate, to kind of walk quietly out of the room and to let them have the fight, but not in your presence, because it's never very edifying. There are both kinds of strings. It would be as though somebody asked a question about Western philosophy. Gee, is Western philosophy empiricist or is it idealist? The answer is yes. There are people of both schools within Western philosophy. The right way to understand Yogācāra, I think, is to understand it as a subjective account of emptiness, which completes and complements the Madhyamaka objective account of emptiness. So the analyses that we see in Madhyamaka of the 2 truths and of the 3 kinds of dependent origination are all analyses of the objects of experience, what things like apples and cows and tables and automobiles and so forth are really like, what their ultimate nature is, what their conventional nature is. Yogācāra starts not from the side of the object, but from the side of the subject. And it's asking the question, what does the nature of our own mind, consciousness, subjectivity have to be in order to create a world that is in fact empty, but appears not to be empty? That's the nature of the illusion. That's the illusion that we're talking about. In order to talk about an illusion, I'm just going to step back for a moment. In the context of Indian philosophy, an illusion always means something that exists in one way, but appears in another. It doesn't mean something that's non-existent. It means something that exists in one way and appears in another. So a mirage, for instance, is an illusion because it exists as a refraction pattern of light, but it appears to be water. An image in a mirror is an illusion because it exists just as light reflecting off a mirror, but it appears to be some person looking at me from beyond the wall. So when we talk about the illusion of intrinsic existence or the illusion of ultimate reality, we do need to ask ourselves the question, how does it arise? And that's the question that Yogācāra asks, complementing the Madhyamaka analysis of the objects of illusion themselves. Emptiness in Yogācāra then is understood somewhat differently from emptiness in Madhyamaka. And what I want to try to convince you of today is that each of these schools has something to say about issues that are of importance, to relational quantum mechanics. So whereas emptiness in the Madhyamaka school is understood as emptiness of intrinsic existence or intrinsic reality, emptiness in the Yogācāra school is thought of first and foremost as emptiness of subject-object duality. So that, and let me try to give you a feel for this for a moment, and I'll bet you share my experience. When I look around at the world, it feels to me as though there's me who's the subject, and then all these objects scattered around me. Computer, some papers, some books, my dog sleeping on the floor, and all of that stuff that aren't part of me, but are objects that confront me. And if I think of this more broadly and try to really pay attention to the nature of my experience, I experience myself as standing outside of the world, and the whole world is just a world of objects around me. The Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who worked in the 20th century, put this beautifully in his book, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, that we experience ourselves as being like the eye in relation, this kind of eye, in relation to the visual field. The eye isn't in the visual field, it's outside of it, but it's necessary, it is the necessary condition of seeing anything, to all of the objects we experience in one way, but our eye is never an object, it's pure subject. And we naively think of ourselves that way. And we think of ourselves as kind of standing outside of the world, in the same sense in which the eye is outside of the visual field, confronting objects. And confronting objects that exist in exactly the way that we perceive them, independently of our perception. That's what we mean by subject-object duality. And that's an illusion. To use a technical term from Western philosophy, that's just bullshit. And it's bullshit in the following way. The moment you reflect on how your experience arises, just from a scientific point of view, no Buddhist mysticism here, just think about visual experience for a moment. I know that when I see my computer, light is bouncing off the screen or radiated from the screen, being refracted through the lens of my eye, through a vitreous jelly in my eyeball, causing photoelectric effects on the back of my retina, causing neural impulses to go through my optic nerve, then through a ventral and dorsal path to my occipital lobe. A whole bunch of electrical activity is happening up there, and that constitutes my experience. None of that is an independently existing computer. All of that is the construction of a world, not the discovery of a world. So one way to understand the primal confusion that gives rise to our very concept of our own experience is that we're always confusing something that we are constantly constructing cognitively with an external world that we are simply confronting. Another way to think about this is to compare the experience of different kinds of animals. I always like to think about bees, dogs, and people. Bees see in the infrared and ultraviolet spectrum, so the world they see is really different from ours. Dogs have a primarily olfactory experience of the world. They experience the world as volumes of smells. We know how we experience it. Those are three different worlds, three different kinds of objects, three different sets of properties. And if you were to ask which one of those is correct, the moment you ask that, you realize how stupid it is. Bees live in bee worlds. Dogs live in dog worlds. We live in human worlds. They overlap a little bit, but not very much. And each of those worlds is constructed by its own kind of subjectivity. So when we think about what we are as subjects, we don't stand outside of our world. We're part of our world. Our objects aren't distinct from us. They're things that we create. And that's the emptiness of subject-object duality. The other kind of emptiness that Yogācārans emphasize in this context is the emptiness of externality. So if we think about the difference between external objects and internal objects, computers and thoughts, dogs and hopes, we think one kind is happening in our mind and the other is happening in the world. But once you understand the emptiness of subject-object duality clearly, you see that everything that we experience is happening in our minds. We never experience something that's independent of our minds. And so this idea of a real distinction between externality and internality is itself an illusion. Once again, though, I want to emphasize that in the Yogācāra school, like the Madhyamaka school, emptiness is never emptiness of existence. It's emptiness of something else. In Madhyamaka, it's emptiness of independence, emptiness of substantiality, emptiness of intrinsic identity. In Yogācāra, it's emptiness of subject-object duality, emptiness of externality. Now, if you want to, you can get into a really nice fight in Buddhism, in the history of Buddhism, between Madhyamaka and Yogācāra, asking which of these is the right account of emptiness. Once again, I advise you to avoid that fight and to think about it instead this way. The Madhyamaka school is giving us a beautiful account of emptiness from the side of the object, and Yogācāra is giving us an account of emptiness from the side of the subject. They're completely complementary. A central doctrine of Yogācāra is the doctrine that, of the three naturelessnesses, that everything that we encounter lacks nature in one of three, in all of three ways. And each of these has to do with subjectivity. The first is that things are empty with respect to the characteristics that we assign them. So if we imagine me and a bee, each looking at a beautiful calla lily, I see it as uniformly white, and the bee sees a whole lot of purple and red dots leading it to the stamens and pistils at the center of the flower, because the bee sees a different spectrum than I do. Again, if we ask who's right, who's wrong, that makes no sense. If we ask, well, what color is the lily really? Is it really just white, or is it really variegated? There's no answer to that question. It's empty of existing in any of those ways. The lily itself has no characteristics. The characteristics come from the side of subjectivity. Again, if we think about quantum theory, we'll see how this plays out. Things are also empty, natureless with respect to production. That is, that nothing has its nature independent. That nature only arises as a result of a causal interaction, a production, the representation of that thing in virtue of its interaction with our perceptual and conceptual apparatus. The lily only exists the way it does because that vision of the lily, that experience of the lily, is produced by my eyes and by my cognitive apparatus. Without talking about that, we can't talk about the nature of the lily at all. We can only talk about the lily as it shows up for me. And finally, with respect to the ultimate, if we ask, yes, 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 okay, the lily is empty of characteristics. It's only something produced in my mind. But we ought to be able to say what it really is. What is it all by itself? And the answer to that question that the Yogācārans give is a resounding, there is no way that things are ultimately or by themselves. There's a beautiful line in the Lankavatara Sutra, a great Yogācāra Sutra, that says, this triple world is not as it appears. That's easy. And then it says, nor is it otherwise. That there is no way that the world is. There are only ways that the world shows up for particular subjects. And it's only in that kind of interaction with subjectivity that things come to exist as objects in a world at all for us. Corresponding to the three naturelessnesses, we can then say every object of our experience has three natures. This is another central Yogācāran doctrine. There's an imagined nature. There's the way we take things to be. I take the lily to be white and external to my mind and existing just as it is, independent of subjectivity. I take the apple to be red and round, independently of me, existing independently of subjectivity. I take myself as a subject to exist as my own mind, independent of any objects of experience. All of those are completely imaginary. They're fabricated. That's a nature that we make up and impute to things. And they only appear as objects with that nature because we have minds and sensory apparatus that are able to experience them and condemned to experience them in that way. The second nature that things have is a dependent nature. That is, the way that they exist, the way that they appear, the way they show up depends entirely upon our senses and our cognition. That's part of what it is to be a perceived apple. An unperceived apple you've never seen, by definition. The perceived apple, by definition, depends upon your perceptual apparatus and the way you conceive of things. And finally, there's a consummate nature, the way that we understand things to be after we've done all of this philosophy. And the consummate nature corresponds to naturelessness with respect to the ultimate, just like the imagined corresponds to naturelessness with respect to characteristic, and the dependent corresponds to naturelessness with respect to production. So the consummate nature of things is that they have absolutely no nature. If you ask me to say, what is a lily really like? What is an apple really like? Just independent of how it's experienced, independent of its interactions with anything else, there is no answer to that question. It's a nonsense question. And finally, this leads us to the central Yogācāran doctrine of non-duality. That subject-object duality with which we began gives way once we understand things in terms of the three naturelessness and the three natures to a non-dual notion of experience. That when we ask ourselves, what is it when I look at the apple, when I look at the computer, when I talk to you, are there two distinct things here? Things happening on the subject side and things happening on the object side? No. The answer is that there's a non-dual ensemble, a completely entangled world in which subjects and objects only show up as subjects and objects in relation to one another. And when they do, it's that ensemble that brings subjectivity and objectivity into existence at the same time. That vision of the eye and the visual field of pure subjects confronting independent objects is nothing but a fantasy. It's imagined. Nothing has that characteristic. Subject-object duality is that of which things are empty from a Yogācāra perspective. Okay, we've now had the fastest introduction in the history of the world to Madhyamaka and Yogācāra. We're going to follow that with the fastest introduction in the history of the world to the Huayan or Avatamsaka flower ornament school of Chinese philosophy, which I love because it so beautifully integrates these two. Again, the founding sutra, just like the founding sutra for Madhyamaka, are the Prajnaparamita or Perfection of Wisdom sutras. The founding sutras for Yogācāra are the Samvita Mochana and the Lankavatara. The founding sutra for Huayan is Avatamsaka, which would translate into Chinese as Huayan. That is the flower ornament sutra. It's an Indian sutra. And the founding philosophical figure is Fatsang. So again, for Madhyamaka, we turn to Nāgārjuna. For Yogācāra, we turn to Asanga and Vasubandhu. For Huayan, we turn to Fatsang. And central idea that is quite beautiful in the Huayan vision of world is to think of emptiness, not as simply the absence of subject-object duality or interdependence, not just as the emptiness of the three natures, but rather to think of it as interpenetration, to think of the idea that every phenomenon in the universe can only be understood in terms of its relation to every other phenomenon. So when we understand any one thing, we only can understand it by understanding its relation to everything else. And once again, there are multiple kinds of interpenetration. One is causal interpenetration. Think about this for a moment. I'm now talking to you. I only exist because my parents existed, gave birth to me, raised me, sent me to schools. I only am able to talk to you about the stuff I know because various teachers learned that, talked about it to me, introduced me to books. A lot of those books exist only because there were trees that grew from seeds, that the sun irradiated them and gave them enough energy to photosynthesize, to live long enough to be cut down, pulped, and made into paper. That brings factories into the picture. That brings the sun, the solar system into the picture. That brings fusion into the picture. That brings the Big Bang. We can do all of this with respect to you as well. Everything that we look at, if we follow causal lines far enough into the past, into the future, and even horizontally into the present, is causally connected to everything else. So if you wanted to ask the question, just what is J. Garfield? He's the thing caused to be what he is by start with my parents, then go back to my grandparents, my great-grandparents, all the way back to the Big Bang. Go to my teachers, go to all of the people who taught them, all of the texts that were written. Go forward to you. Oh, he's the guy who's talking to me right now. Who am I? I'm the person who was given birth by my parents, who was taught by my teachers, who ate this food that was raised by these farmers, and so forth. So these causal links go on absolutely forever. Conceptual interpenetration. If we want to say what I am, we have to distinguish me from everything else in the world and talk about my connections to everything else in the world. And once again, it goes on indefinitely and constitutively. I'm made up of my parts. Those parts are made up of small parts, and those parts are made of parts. But I'm also a part of a family. I'm part of a community. I'm part of a state. I'm part of a nation. I'm part of a college. I'm part of a species. I'm part of the inhabitants of a planet. I'm part of a solar system, part of a galaxy. And so once again, the moment we talk constitutively about what I am, we end up talking about the entire universe. And the Huayan vision is the idea that for every entity you look at in the universe, it is dependent in these three ways on every other entity in that universe. And so its identity is interpenetrated. A favorite metaphor for this is the idea of the net of Indra. That's the idea, the following idea. You want to imagine the god Indra, who's the king or the president of all of the Indian gods, who somewhere in space has an infinite network of perfectly reflecting jewels, beautiful diamonds, that are each connected to one another. And each of those diamonds reflects every other diamond completely. So that every diamond in that net is distinct. It's not that there's one diamond. There are trillions and quadrillions and an infinite number of diamonds. They're each distinct from one another. But each of those diamonds can only be described as the thing reflecting all of the other diamonds. Every one of them depends upon the other for its identity. They are distinct and yet identical in nature because completely interpenetrated. And so in the net of Indra, we have the complete interpenetration of all phenomena and this kind of reciprocal dependence that we don't want to say that dependence goes one way. that thing B depends upon A depends upon another, and so forth, but rather that everything is mutually dependent in this reciprocal way. And that means that the existence that anything has is a thoroughly relational existence. When we look at that net of Indra, the only way that any jewel exists, that any jewel has the property that it does, is by being related through the relation of reflection to every other jewel in the net, mutatis mutandis, for every entity in the real conventional world. Fatsang also introduces this beautiful idea by talking about golden lions. You want to imagine a little statue of a gold lion. And Fatsang points out that the gold in the lion is only a lion because it's got a particular shape. So the gold is only a lion because of its shape. But the shape is only a shape because of the gold. You can't just take the gold away and keep the shape, or keep the shape, take the shape away and keep the gold. The gold always has a shape, and the shape always has the gold. Moreover, the golden lion has all these parts. It's got a tail, it's got whiskers, it's got eyes, and so forth. And each of those parts is only a part of a golden lion because it's related to the whole lion. But the lion itself is only a lion because it has all of those parts. So once again, we have this constant reciprocal interdependence between parts and wholes. And this notion of complete interpenetration comes back to us. The tail of the lion can't be a tail without the lion, and the lion can't be a lion without its tails. And so what the Huayan tradition gives us is a vision of interdependence that is thoroughly non-well-founded. If you ask, what's the most fundamental level that everything else depends upon? Where's the base? Where's the ground? The Huayan answer is, there is none. Everything simply is interdependent and interpenetrating everything else with absolutely no ground, absolutely no foundation. There is no basic level. There's nothing that we can have all on its own without anything else. So those are the three schools of Buddhist philosophy to which I wanted to introduce you. And now we can talk a little bit about quantum mechanics from the standpoint of these three schools. And the first thing I want to say is why it's RQM, relational quantum mechanics, that has really attracted attention within the Buddhist world, as opposed to Copenhagen or Bayesian quantum mechanics. Here's one of the most important reasons. If you're in Copenhagen or Bayesian quantum mechanics, there's a very, very special role given to minds or conscious observers. We talk about wave functions collapsing on observation, for instance. We talk about, the famous Schrodinger cat experiment requires an observer. With quantum Bayesianism, in Bayesian statistical framework, we need to have conscious beings with priors making estimates, making observations, and so forth. So there's a clear distinction being made between things that are observers and have minds and things that don't. And that reintroduces a duality between subjects and objects, subjectivity and objectivity. Subjects in this sense are the things who are making observations. Objects are the things that are observed. And that amounts to a peculiar kind of idealism, this notion that the world only comes into existence, only as the properties that it does in virtue of subjects. What Buddhist philosophers have smiled on when they see RQM is that the idea of observer relativity that we see in both Copenhagen and Bayesian quantum mechanics is replaced with a much more general category. That's the category of interaction, which can simply be a causal interaction, not necessarily a conscious or an observational interaction. And that way we keep the ontology, keep the metaphysics of our system relational, which is something that we saw as in common in Madhyamaka, Yogācāra, and Huayan philosophy, without the idealism that sometimes creeps in to Yogācāra philosophy that we have to avoid by focusing on those three natures and on the idea of non-duality of subject and object. So the thing that Buddhist philosophers have loved about RQM is that it rejects that dualism of mind and matter, that kind of vision of the eye and the visual field that we see as vitiating. Oh, forget that, both Copenhagen and that should be QB and Bayesian quantum theory. And so relational quantum mechanics looks to most of us as something more closely in line with a broadly Buddhist framework shared by the Madhyamaka, Yogācāra, and Huayan schools. So now I wanted to talk a little bit and to conclude by how emptiness plays such a central role as the ultimate nature of reality, the ultimate truth in Buddhist philosophy and relational quantum mechanics. Well, one is this idea of relationality independent origination. When we look at relational quantum mechanics, we get the idea that the only kind of existence that anything has is existence in relation to something else. And gosh, that looks a whole lot like the dependent origination that we find in the Madhyamaka tradition. And when we look at the way the two truths are articulated in the Madhyamaka tradition, we say that we can understand them as two different levels of description of reality. On the one hand, all phenomena are ultimately empty of any intrinsic existence, and emptiness is just simply what we find after ultimate analysis. No independent events, just a kind of absence of any intrinsic identity. But then what that, at a higher level, the level of just ordinary experience, the level in which we live most of our lives, we find conventional objects, apples and lilies and tables and chairs and dogs and cats. Similarly, when we look at relational quantum mechanics, we find a quantum level in which we've got absolutely nothing that shows up as an object in any sense. But through quantum interaction, we've got all of that quantum fields manifesting themselves as dogs, cats, tables, and chairs. Quantum fields themselves are empty of any of those entities, just as emptiness is. But quantum fields manifest themselves at the macroscopic level as a conventional reality. And manifestation, then, as I've just said, is the bridge between these, right? So the bridge between the two levels in the Madhyamaka and Yogācāra tradition is this notion of manifestation or of appearance. So we can say that emptiness appears to us as dog, cats, tables, and chairs. Those things appear as though they exist intrinsically, permanently, independently, but they don't. But what they are, when we really analyze them, is the manifestation of dependent origination. And similarly, in RQM, when we find the macroscopic world, what we find is a manifestation of quantum level interactions, not two different things, quantum field and the empirical world, but rather a quantum field manifesting to beings like us as an empirical world. And again, the possibility that it could manifest to very different beings, bees, dogs, and so forth, as very different worlds, because of very different quantum interactions between those fields and the kind of perceptual systems that we find in those organisms. Similarly, we find these ideas of non-duality, interpenetration, and the three naturelessnesses in both ideas. So relational quantum mechanics does away with strong subject-object duality. In relational quantum mechanics, when we start looking at quantum fields, everything interpenetrates everything else. We can't isolate parts of fields as having independent existence. Rather, that interdependence and interpenetration just goes on forever. Moreover, we can reconstruct each of the three naturelessnesses in relational quantum mechanics. Naturelessness with respect to characteristic. If we ask, where's the red of the apple in the quantum field? The answer is, it's not there. It emerges only in the interaction of quantum phenomena with observers like us. What exists independently in the field? Nothing at all. And what is the actual ultimate nature of things independent of any interaction? There absolutely is none. So those three naturelessnesses reappear as well. Notice that I'm moving back and forth between Madhyamaka ideas, Yogācāra ideas, and Mahāyāna ideas. That's what I think is so cool about RQM. It gives us a way of showing how each of these ideas plays out in concert with the others when we turn from pure Buddhist philosophy to physics. And finally, reality has got these three natures. It's got an imagined nature. There's a way the world seems to be when we just look at it. And it really does seem to be that way. It really does appear and manifest in that way. But it manifests in that way with this kind of impression that that's just the way it is and that we are just reliable detectors of that reality, but we're not. So we find the imagined nature. We find the dependent nature. The way that reality shows up for us depends entirely on interactions between and relations between fields that we don't know directly and perceptual and conceptual apparatus that we bring to it. So there's a dependent nature to the world that is manifest to us as a result of all of these interactions. And finally, there's the consummate nature, that is that there is nothing we can say at all about how anything is independent. We find that in Yogācāra, you find that in our QM. And so what we have, I think, when we put together the Madhyamaka schools of Buddhist philosophy and relational quantum mechanics is a beautiful unification of the Buddhist idea of emptiness and dependent origination and the idea of the world as a manifestation of an underlying quantum reality of which we have no direct awareness and which has no independent properties on its own. That's what I wanted to say to you today. And now I have said it, so I can stop sharing my screen and return from Nalanda to real life. Thank you.
Okay. Whoa, this was a very dense talk, and I think it's a great outline for how to start thinking about the bridges between Buddhist schools and quantum mechanics, and something to develop over the next months and years, I guess. Thanks so much for giving this concise overview and how to think about this problem. So we have no questions right now, so please write them down also, and I think they will come trickling in. I have to start the discussion. I have a question. How would you see that the relational quantum mechanics stands in comparison to Buddhist thought? Do you think it's equivalent, or would you say it just fits in perfectly?
Equivalent would be wrong. I mean, for us to say, gee, that somehow, somewhere in the Buddhist tradition, people developed the notion of quantum gravity and of fields and figured out how tensor geometry works and all of that. That's nuts, right? I mean, that really is crazy. Physics brings to us a set of conceptual resources and conceptual skills that are utterly foreign to the Indian and Tibetan Buddhist traditions. And that's not to deprecate one or the other. That's just to say, to claim that somehow modern science was already present in classical India, I think is just another superimposition. Moreover, to claim that quantum physics is really a branch of Buddhism is just as much a distortion. Buddhism, when we start looking at what inframes it, is a philosophical system aimed at liberation from the suffering of cyclic existence. And it's a system that includes philosophical ideas, meditative practices, ritual practices, monastic communities, and so forth. And every time I go into a physics department, I fail to see people in monastic robes. I don't see any butter lamps. I don't see anybody worrying about liberation from cyclic existence. So I do not want to claim that somehow quantum physics is just one more school of Buddhism. And I hear people say those kinds of things all the time, and I want to scream. First, you've got to get clear about what each side is before you can understand the relation between them. The relations between them are nonetheless deeply significant. Many of the insights to which Buddhist philosophers came in the course of trying to understand the nature of existence, the nature of suffering, and the nature of liberation, like the ones I've been talking about today, are shared as metaphysical insights by people who have penetrated into the nature of reality from the mathematical world and the physics lab, as opposed to from the meditation cushion. And I think that one of the things that we can agree about is that epistemologically, when we find convergence from completely independent epistemic roots, we've got a kind of confirmation. So if I look out of the window and say it's raining, and you look out of the window and say it's beautiful and sunny, then I start worrying about which of us has got a serious eye problem. But if I look out and say it's raining, and you look out and say it's raining, convergence leads me to believe that it really is raining. I think that we are seeing both from the Buddhist side and from the physics side the claim that it's raining, that certain kinds of emptiness pervade reality, certain kinds of relationality are the best way to understand that emptiness, that trying to understand the ordinary world as non-existent is a non-starter, but trying to understand that it is completely different from an underlying reality is also a non-starter, that manifestation is the key to that, that relationality is the key to that. And to remember that we as human beings live in a world that is constructed by our sensory and cognitive apparatus and is completely illusory in the sense that it appears to exist in one way, but it really exists in another way and constantly calls upon us to interrogate it, to ask what it's really like. And then at the end of that interrogation, we come up with the following answer. There is no way that it's really. And that's the really cool convergence.
Maybe a follow-up on question, as we are waiting for more questions to trickle in on what you just said. So for me, the Madhyamaka, the approach is very helpful because in a sense, it takes away all ontologies. It always keeps the question up, keep looking. And but what I often I have the question then, it's one thing to take it away as to keep the question alive, but what is knowing in all of this? There's like there's a knowingness which is, or a wisdom which is generated here, and I don't find it often addressed because it just keeps the process going, but it won't give you answers, at least not in written form. But what is the knowing in these Madhyamaka texts?
I think there are different levels of knowing. So there's first, and I think this is really important to see. Firstly, there's conventional knowing. I do know that it is Tuesday and that I'm talking to you on Zoom, and all of that is correct. And we need an account of how that knowledge goes, because without relying on conventional epistemology, we can't penetrate into the ultimate. That's really important. Parallel to the physics case, there's ordinary perceptual knowledge. Without that, I can't even read the instruments that are giving me the output of my tunneling electron microscope, right? If we can't agree that, oh yeah, that's a number 2, that one's number 3, then we're nowhere. So there's conventional knowledge that's a beginning. Then there's analytic understanding of the ultimate, or categorized understanding of the ultimate. So when we pursue this, this analysis, we come up with the idea that all things are dependently originating, that nothing has intrinsic identity. That's what Tsongkhapa called the categorized ultimate, conceptually understood ultimate. Once we understand that, we also come to understand that our concepts are inadequate to the reality. Why? Because our concepts are always reorganizing the reality to us. Our perceptual apparatus are always reorganizing. And so we come to know that the way things really are is something that is going to be forever inaccessible to us. Not because we're stupid or limited, but because there is no way that things are independent of any way of accessing. But that in itself is a higher level of wisdom. Now what we've come to understand is not only what we know about the conventional world and what we know conceptually about the ultimate, but we come to understand that, and there is no sense of an ultimate reality that outstrips that. So that's a higher level. We might think, that's exactly the way it is. But now we see that we're climbing a hierarchy, because we also see that is merely a conceptual construct and so forth. Chinese philosopher Jizang did this very beautifully in what we call Jizang's hierarchy, when he says at the bottom there's just conventional truth. Then you begin to realize that conventional truth is actually wrong. And that shows you that ultimate truth must be right. But that shows you that the ultimate truth and conventional truth have to be the same. But then you realize that that's just convention. So it has to be wrong. So you understand that understanding of the relation between the conventional and the ultimate can't be an understanding of the proper level. And so you understand that you've got to achieve that level uh-oh, that's conventional as well. And you just keep on going. But now, so it sounds like you never hit the top of that hierarchy. But now we're standing outside of that hierarchy, realizing that we don't hit the top. Same paradox. So at some point, you take a long, deep breath and you recognize that profound Yogacaran idea of the consummate nature. There is no way that things are. And that's why my favorite line in all of Buddha Dharma is that line in the Lankavatara Sutra. This triple world is not as it appears, nor is it otherwise.
Great line. Yeah. Thank you. So we have questions now. So we have somebody, Chris Fields from the panel, and we have 3 questions in the audience. Let's maybe start with Chris and then take the... Chris, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, thank you very much, Jay. That was a lovely talk.
Thank you.
My wife and I have been sitting here listening to it, and she liked it too.
Oh, good.
I just wanted to make a couple of comments. One, to defend Chris Fuchs a little bit. I think that Cubism is actually more relational than you might have made it out to be, and that Cubism, like Carla's approach, when it mentions an observer, it just means any physical system. And so it treats any physical system as a Bayesian agent, even an electron. So the broader comment is that I think it's really interesting that we can take, in the context of quantum theory, this subjective approach to anything, any system at all, from an elementary particle up to, some enormously macroscopic system like a black hole, and treat all of them as observers in exactly the same way. So I just wanted to throw that out there from the point of view of students who might be interested in Cubism as an approach. So thanks again. Great talk. Lovely.
That's very, very helpful. I've always read Cubism in a more explicitly Bayesian context, thinking that one's got to, come to an observation with priors that are then being revised, and sort of think of it very much subjectively. And in fact, you used the word subjective a moment ago. So if I'm misunderstanding Cubism, then I apologize for that. It's the subjectivity and the distinction between subject and object that at least underlies Bayesian probability theory and Bayesian decision theory that I want to avoid, and really to talk about interactions, not observations. I think the moment you begin talking about observations, it at least feels like you're bringing in a difference between the subjective and the objective side. But I could be wrong about that, because as I said at the very beginning, I plead complete ignorance about quantum physics.
Yeah, thanks. I would just say that observation and the word manifestation that you use are probably exactly the same.
Yeah, then it may well turn out that our QM and QB may be notational variants of one another somewhere down the line.
Yeah. Well, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. First question by Christian Stormname. Thank you for the introduction. I'm curious about the parallels between Eastern and Western understanding of subject-object unfolds. How would Spinoza react to the description of non-duality? Wouldn't he argue that there is a way of reaching beyond the subject-object duality through what he referred to as intellectual intuition? And what you then see is God or nature, which we could see as a ground of being, or what Atmansbacher and Rickles refer to as a psychophysical neutral.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm not going to give a satisfactory answer, I promise, but I'll say what I can. So the first thing to say is there is a gigantic network of cottage industry on Spinoza and Buddhism. And as you're probably aware, lots of people have noticed parallels between Spinoza's thought and certain Buddhist thought. And I think that you're right to put your finger on those. I think where things get complex in trying to make that an identity is to talk about a kind of ground of being, which I do think Spinoza takes God, the substance, to be. And that, to my mind, is really where the difference is between the Spinozist understanding of reality and the Buddhist understanding of reality. Because if you ask a Buddhist, what's the ground of being? The answer is, that doesn't make any sense. That the very idea of there being a ground is the problem. By the way, for those who are interested in this is now a bit of advertising. Mind and Life Europe's European Summer Research Institute this year is focusing entirely on groundlessness. So if you want to really dive deep into philosophy, Buddhism, physics, and groundlessness, you come to Pomaya in August and swelter in Tuscany and listen to people talk about this. It'll be fun. I think there's still space. So that's advertising. Mind and Life Europe, ESRI 2025. So I think the biggest shade of difference there is one between seeing a non-dual reality as a ground and seeing it as the idea that there's no ground. So not looking for a psychophysical neutral, but arguing that the psychophysical duality is illusory from the start. In that respect, by the way, if you were asking me, and I guess you were, I would say that the Spinozist way of seeing things is weirdly closer to that of Advaita Vedanta than it is to Buddhism. And then the footnote is, and by the way, there's also an industry devoted to showing why Advaita Vedanta and Yogācāra Buddhism are exactly the same. And again, I think that, again, they share many ideas, like the ideas we've been talking about, but they come apart at the same place. The question about whether there is a thing that is the non-dual ground, like for Advaita Vedanta, Sat Chit Ananda, this kind of blissful existence as consciousness, versus Yogācāra Buddhism, there is no ground. The idea of a ground is the illusion. So I hope that helps a little bit. That is, I want to say these are really close cousins. But as my late friend Sandy Huntington used to say, the finer the hair, the more important it is to split it. This is a beautifully fine hair, but I think it's really important to split it. And when we split it, we see that the kind of metaphysical question before us is the question of ground versus groundlessness.
Thank you. Next question by Matthew. Is there anything regarding conflict, specifically destructive conflict, to which these beautiful philosophies and practices can illuminate?
Well, gosh, maybe. I think that a lot of human conflict is actually, and I think this is something that the Buddha got right, is driven by the illusion of intrinsic identity. Specifically, it's driven by the illusion that I exist intrinsically as at the center of the universe. That idea of the I individual field of subject-object duality gives rise inevitably to the idea that everybody else is just my object and I'm the subject. And the moment I decide that I've got special interests, conflict is inevitable. And by the way, I think this is the thing that is wrong with contemporary economic theory, if you want to jump ahead. And that is the idea that rationality consists in my disinterested pursuit of my own utility, definition of rationality in microeconomic theory. Because if anybody ever thought that their own happiness was independent of the happiness of others and something that they ought to pursue in disregard of the happiness for others, they're out of their minds. That's what leads us to gated communities, to income inequality, to people needing bodyguards, and so forth. And so I think that the Buddha's idea that the illusion of self, and so the illusion of subject-object duality, lies at the root of conflict and suffering, was roughly right. And that the more we can begin to develop a non-dual interdependent vision of who we are, we begin to see that the idea of trying to keep one of the jewels in Indra's net and throw away all the others is moronic.
Thank you. Next question by Senta. The goals of quantum mechanics and Buddhist philosophy lead to different outcomes, right? Quantum mechanics still reifies reality, though at a more abstract and more fluid and more independent way? It's a question.
I don't know is the answer. I think that the promise of RQM, as I read it, and that is as I read it, because I am not a physicist, is of getting away entirely from that reification and developing an understanding of things as not having any intrinsic reality, any intrinsic identity. Remember, Buddhism doesn't deny that anything is real. That would be not failure to reify, but would be the extreme of nihilism. Rather, Buddhism wants to argue that things are real, but shouldn't be reified, that they are interdependently and conventionally real. And I kind of see that as where RQM is going. So I'm kind of optimistic, but that might just reflect my misunderstanding of RQM, being not a physicist.
Thank you. Ravi Kumar is asking, thank you, Professor J. Garfield, for this enlightening lecture. I am a little bit curious about the relationship between Hindu concept of nothingness and the Buddhist philosophy of emptiness. Are there any similarity in both of them? Simply put, it is all that exists and appears temporary. So the ancient Hindu scriptures talk about this idea of nothingness, but in a spiritual way. For example, Vedanta philosophy sees nothingness or shunyata as the fundamental absolute beyond any specific forms of idea or ideas, as the ultimate reality. How would you differentiate between both of them?
Okay, thank you for that question, Ravi. I think I partly answered it a few minutes ago in the answer to the other question. As I pointed out, there are many people who think that Advaita Vedanta and Yogācāra are very, very close to one another, maybe the same. A friend of mine always referred to Yogācāra as Vedanta pursued by other means. I think that there is something to that, depending upon which readings of Yogācāra you prefer, especially if you prefer idealistic readings like those of Stiramati and Vinitadeva. I don't think it works so well if you're looking at a Sangha or Vasubandhu, by the way. But if you look at the idealists like Stiramati and Vedanta, and sorry, my mind has just gone dead. Anyway, then you're going to find really interesting connections. But I think there's always going to be the difference. The difference is that as you put it, it's central to the Advaita Vedanta position that there is a non-dual reality that is the ground of existence, the Sat-Chit Ananda. That's exactly what Yogācāra, among other Buddhist schools, is denying, that there is no fundamental ground. So Advaita Vedantins see that as nihilistic because it's denying that there's anything. Buddhists see that as realistic because it's recovering the reality of everything else and saying you don't need anything real in order to ground them, and see the Vedantins as reifying emptiness.
Thank you. Next question by chat. If Mahayana teaching on emptiness and relation parallels, and in the case of Carlo Rovelli, informs quantum mechanics, how might Mahayana teachings on compassion and liberation parallel and inform an emancipatory quantum social science?
I don't know, but it would be totally cool. I think that Mahayana ethics can certainly inform social science and gives us a lot of insight. Whether that would take us back to quantum theory, I don't know, but it does take us to interdependence. Michael, I'm going to have to ask for a 1-minute break if I can. I've got to deal with something in the house, and I'll be right back.
Okay.
So give it a 60-second break, and I'll be right back.
Take your time.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, so in the meantime, if anyone has other questions, we have one more left, and we still have 10 minutes, so.
If we run out, I can ask a question at the end.
Oh yeah.
So
should always go, yeah.
Well,
Oh, and we should also mention that there will be, if you can make it, there will be, after Karen's talk, who will be next, there's like a open discussion after the half an hour break during lunchtime. So if you can join there, and we hope that Karen can join, and we will ask also Jay to join. Not sure. This would be a good place to continue asking questions. Kelly, did you tell Jay about this?
Did I what?
Did you tell Jay about the lunch break?
I told all the speakers about the open discussion, the links for everything.
And for those who have to log out in the meantime, this open discussion is not on this Zoom link. It's another Zoom link, and Kelly just posted it, and you will also find it on the webpage. It's a regular meeting style.
I'm back. Okay.
Good. Then the next question by Leslie. Oh,
Yeah.
now you should be able to see it. Leslie asks, can you summarize why we are exploring the connections or similarities between Buddhism and quantum? Does Buddhism embrace some quantum-like principles? If so, please summarize what they hold in common.
Huh. Okay. Here's one boring answer to why we are exploring that, because I was asked to. A second boring answer is that Carlo Rovelli has really argued that Nāgārjuna's Madhyamaka was the source and inspiration for relational quantum mechanics. So but these are accidents. These aren't conceptual answers to your question. So I just raised them to point out that there are kind of contextual reasons. What I've tried to argue, and maybe it hasn't been clear enough, is I think there are real connections. There's a reason here. And that is that because both quantum mechanical theory and Buddhist theory emphasize a world that appears in one way but exists in another, a world that is the manifestation of an underlying reality that is utterly different from the reality that we experience, and a world in which the only kind of existence that anything has is a relational, conventional existence. And both try to understand how it is that a manifest world in which we function as human beings arises from an unimaginable, literally unimaginable world that we can only understand through models that nonetheless manifests in the way that we experience reality. And so that convergence leads us to say, hey, quantum physicists aren't really philosophers. They're doing the hard mathematical and experimental work to show how the details go. But Buddhists, who are not physicists, were pretty good at understanding the big conceptual issues. Maybe if we put the white coats and the red robes together, we can get an understanding that brings complementary sources of knowledge and frameworks to bear in order to get a unified understanding. And that's kind of what we're trying to do. There's no guarantee that it's going to work, but it's at least something to do in July.
Thank you. Then Senta, just as a comment, she thanks you for the wonderful talk and deep appreciations to Jay for such a concise and comprehensive walk through the three major Buddhist schools and quantum mechanics. And now we go to Alex, a question.
Well, how much time do we? Well, I guess I can ask a question.
Yeah.
It's a naive question. I guess in all the talks we've had at this camp over the past several years, one of my main concerns is to preserve or somehow save consciousness and conscious experience in the sort of subjective experiential sense. And so when I hear about relational quantum mechanics, I wonder, where is consciousness in that picture and where does it fit in? And I guess I had the same question listening to you. It was a great talk, by the way. Sorry, I should have begun with that. But I guess I'm wondering, where does the traditional Western philosophical problem of where does experience come from? Where does that question fit in this kind of picture, which seems to kind of push the question out of the picture? And so I'm wondering what you do with the traditional problem.
I think it does push it out of the picture. And I want to emphasize, first of all, that there's big battles going on in the world of Buddhist philosophy and phenomenology on this. So if you had me and Michelle Bitbol on at the same time, you'd have a big battle about this, for instance. Or me and Christian Kosovo at the same time, you'd have a big battle about this. So
Bitbol was one of our speakers a couple of years ago. So.
Yeah, so what I don't want you to do is to think that I'm speaking for the profession. The profession is not in consensus, nor are Buddhist schools in consensus, which is why the profession isn't in consensus. So I'm talking from my own perspective right now. But I think one of the great achievements of the Madhyamaka is that it doesn't talk about consciousness. It talks about being conscious, but it's a school that really hates nominalization and reification. So just as when I'm moving, this is Nāgārjuna, I'm not moving because I've got some motion in my pocket or motion in me. The fact that I'm in motion is a relation between my position at different places and my positions at different times. When I am conscious, it's because my psychophysical processes are in interaction with some object. But that doesn't mean that it's in virtue of there being a consciousness, that there really are just causally open continua of psychophysical processes. And when those involve the kind of systematic impact on psychological processes of other things, we say that we're conscious of them. But that doesn't mean that we're conscious of them because there's consciousness. And that kind of conscious avoidance of reification is something that runs through the Mahāyāna tradition, and one of the reasons that I like it. I've always thought that the proton suttas, right, the first false step in most of contemporary consciousness science is the substantive consciousness. Not asking what is it to be conscious, but what is consciousness. I want to say there ain't no such thing. And I'm following a large part of the Buddhist tradition in that, not all of it. Does that help?
Well, I could say more, but Joyce has her question also, and I want her to have a chance. So, okay. Yeah.
I just have a quick follow-up. Very interesting. Thank you so much for the very concise, exactly as the participant was saying, concise and entailing talk. So actually follow up with what you were just responding to Alex. I wonder, and that's why basically this is something sounds like why maybe the relational quantum mechanics different in a very key way from maybe to my understanding Copenhagen's interpretation is the avoidance of this wave function collapsing to reality.
Yeah.
So it's like really just relational. Right. So there's no collapsing of wave function.
Yeah, and I think that has to do with the eschewing of a notion of subjectivity as a special kind of thing and of kind of special role for conscious observers.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I have another maybe quick follow-up too, is that at the moment during the talk, I almost thought sounds maybe like the many words interpretation of the quantum mechanics, but then differently, there is the ultimate truth of this reality out there. So that's the belief.
Yeah.
So I wonder for practice, what that means to us for everyday life.
Yeah, I think that's kind of fun. I actually started at one point to write a paper about that, about called Many Worlds and Many Worlds, which was comparing the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics with the multiplicity of worlds that we find represented in the Bhava Chakra and in Buddhist cosmology. And then I put it aside because I decided that it was just going to cause confusion. But I might pick it up sometime, I'm not sure. Notice that the multiplicity of worlds come in for different reasons and to solve different problems, though there's a tantalizing kind of connection. And it depends a little bit on how far you were willing to press the many worlds of Buddhism. And some ways of pressing that in order to get enough worlds, like namely infinitely many of them, I think would put strain on the notion of the term loka in Sanskrit. So I'm of two minds on this. One, I can't resist the pun, and the other is I don't want the pun to confuse things. So now let me try to explain what I mean by that. The idea of many worlds in the Buddhist world comes out of the kind of cosmology of there being a human realm, a Preta realm, hell realms, divine realms, animal realms, Asuriya realms, and so forth, and thinking about literal rebirth into those different realms, right? But that immediately can get rolled back once you start thinking about the role of metaphor in Buddhism and the centrality of psychology in Buddhism, to thinking that these many worlds are kind of many modes of consciousness, right? But it's also, that's important, right? Because as I said earlier, I think that one of the things that happens when we reflect on Buddhist accounts of the construction of the world is that, you know, my dog who's in here with me and I really do live in different worlds. For him, there's big volumes of smell that determine the way the world is. And the world is basically a close to monochrome place from a visual point of view, but extremely rich and variegated from an olfactory point of view. For me, there's just a lot more colors than he can ever see visually, but I don't have a clue about these olfactory volumes and their, you know, arising and ceasing and decay that drive his world. And then again, you add butterflies and bees and sharks to that, and all of a sudden, all kinds of different worlds emerge. Notice, though, that this is what's really important and why I think that trying to press the pun too far goes wrong. One, we tend to think that my world and your world are pretty much shared in virtue of a near identity of our cognitive and visual systems and sets of concerns. From a kind of literal perspective. Secondly, and I think more importantly, we think my world and my dog's world nonetheless overlap a lot. That's why we can talk to each other. That's why when I throw the Frisbee, he still goes and catches it and brings it back to me, right? So we've got this overlap of worlds that we don't find in a many worlds interpretation. And then we've got the notion of shared worlds, and the fact that if you then take the psychological interpretation of many Buddhist worlds, then each of us is moving from world to world pretty constantly. So now I'm mostly I hope in a pretty human world. But, you know, there was a time, you know, right before this, this talk when I was a little bit nervous about it, when I was probably kind of in a little bit of a hell realm and so forth. And so that notion of loka as something that is a state of consciousness into which we can move in or out, and loka as a location that we all share, is at odds with many worlds in quantum mechanics. So, like I say, I was going to begin with a pun and then go from there. And then I worried that the pun would cause more confusion than clarity. I hope that helps a little bit.
Thanks very much.